Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar from APQC and BCG on the topic of operational resilience. I'm Marisa Brown, and I'm the Senior Principal Research Lead for Supply Chain Management here at APQC, and I'll be the moderator today. As we move to the next slide, I want to leave you with a point to ponder, and that is, if disruption is the new normal, then operation resilience is the new necessity. So today we're going to be sharing with you some great insights from our friends at BCG related to how to focus on finding resilience. And if we move to our headshot slide, I want to introduce our speakers and let them say a few words about who they are. But I also want to point out that today's webinar is being recorded. We're going to have about 45 minutes or so for the presentation, but we encourage you to submit your questions all throughout the webinar. We want to hear from you in both the Q&A and in the chat. And we have even a couple of polls where you have an opportunity to share your thoughts with us. You will receive a copy of both the slides and the recording after the webinar is completed in the next few days. And if you have any technical issues, don't hesitate to reach out to the APQC host on the call. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jeremy and Ben.
Thanks, Marisa. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeremy Kay. I'm a managing director and partner with BCG. I'm really happy to be here today talking about supply chain resilience, or more broadly, operational resilience. It's a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. I've spent my whole career in operations. The first 10 years was in procurement and supply chain roles in the automotive industry. And it was about 12 years ago when I first got involved with resilience. I helped start the first supplier risk management program at a commercial vehicle OEM that I was working for at the time. And this was right before the Fukushima nuclear disaster. So as you can imagine, we got put through our paces pretty quickly on that one. And that's when I first realized that to become truly resilient, you need visibility to not just your direct supply chain, your direct suppliers, but you need visibility multiple tiers down in the supply chain. And it's what really started to get me kind of passionate about this topic. So, fast forward to today, my colleague Ben Ayler and I co-lead BCG's capability around supply chain resiliency. And I also serve clients across a broad range of other operations topics, particularly supply chain, procurement, and cost transformation programs. Ben?
Thanks, Jeremy. So hello, everyone. Ben Ayler. I'm a managing director and senior partner with BCG. I think similar experience to Jeremy. I've been at BCG almost 20 years, focusing on operations and supply chain. And we'll talk about it as we get into it. A lot of my focus, and I suspect a lot of your focuses over the years have been on efficiency, and that's not that is still important. But I think what we are all living through recently is that as supply chains focus on efficiency, sometimes inadvertently we introduce risk into the supply chain. And so I'm eager to talk today about what we're seeing from many of our clients and companies, and hopefully do so in a way that can give you some actionable things to take on to improve your company's position. Looking forward to the discussion. Jeremy?
Great, thanks. So if we move on to the next slide here, Marisa already covered that one, but we have a couple more minutes. We'll intro you to Boston Consulting Group if you're not familiar with us. Ben will lead us through the case for change. I'll come back and cover findings from our recent resilience benchmarking survey and report that we did together with APQC. And then we'll leave plenty of room at the end for question and answer. But I'd also encourage everyone to ask questions along the way. If it's something about a particular topic or page that we're on, it's better for us to address those kind of questions in the moment than wait all the way until the end. So please feel free to engage with us through the Q&A function or the chat function. And looking forward to a great discussion today. So if you're not familiar with Boston Consulting Group, here's a few facts and figures. Some folks are kind of surprised to see that BCG is an $11 billion company with 25,000 employees in 50 different countries. So we're not just in Boston anymore. And we have 21 practice areas, which basically means we support clients across pretty much every industry and every kind of topic or functional discipline that you can think of. So today we're here to talk about operations. And so within manufacturing and supply chain, well, first of all, operations is about a quarter of the business that BCG does. So it's not just a small thing off to the side, but this is something that's really core to our business. We have 600 experts in manufacturing supply chain who are former practitioners in the industry like I am, or have spent their careers in consulting, building these capabilities, helping clients across a variety of industries, variety of topics. We've completed over 2,000 different projects for clients in the past, I think this is the past 5 years. We're constantly publishing new thought leadership on the topic. Happy for you to peruse around bcg.com. We're always coming out with new articles and new information. And then we also have quite the infrastructure developed, including some model factories. And we can help clients with kind of any problem, from something really basic to just process re-engineering or lean efficiency in a plant, all the way to advanced digital technologies leveraging AI. All right, so that's enough of the BCG sales pitch. I'll turn it over to Ben to walk us through the case for change.
Thanks, Jeremy. All right. We've all seen the challenges that global supply chains have had in recent years. It gained a lot of visibility during COVID, but certainly didn't start with COVID. Jeremy was mentioning Fukushima, now seems, a long time ago. But we also don't think that it is going to end, the disruptions are going to end now that we are hopefully coming out of major COVID outbreaks. Given this context, many companies are increasingly focusing on better understanding the risks that they see for their supply chains. And there we go. And those risks can derive from many different sources, whether they are the big geopolitical or catastrophe risks that get a lot of visibility in the media, or more day-to-day risks like supplier shortages or logistics disruptions. And this kind of risk landscape, frankly, can be overwhelming at first, but this is the world in which we all operate today. Another point I wanted to make here is that there are two complementary trends going on. One is an increase in the frequency and severity of some of these risks. And the other is the fact that many, if not most companies, have been, as I mentioned at the beginning, focusing on efficiency in their supply chains for decades now. And so while reducing costs and streamlining supply chains, many companies have also made their supply chains fragile to whatever some of these risks may arise. And so, as Marisa mentioned at the beginning, we are curious about what risk you all are seeing. And so let's do a little poll and see which of these types of risks are you most concerned about in 2023. It's multiple choice. You can pick more than one. And you can pick all of them if that's how you're feeling. But I'm curious to see what is most prevalent in your minds.
And while we're waiting for some of those results to come in, Ben, I really like what you said about the frequency and severity of these kind of risks increasing. The title of this webinar is if disruption is the new normal, operational resilience is the new necessity. And I really do believe that there is a new normal. Even with COVID sort of ebbing and flowing, and eventually, hopefully, that kind of dies out and goes away, or we just become used to it. There's going to be more. There's going to be more disruptions coming. With climate change, with the state of geopolitics today, and trade barriers and things like that. This is going to be something that is going to be top of mind for supply chain leaders for the foreseeable future, at least in my view.
Great points, guys. And I guess what you're saying is the new normal is abnormal. So I want to encourage all of you on attendance to please vote in the poll. As Ben and Jeremy said, you can select multiple risks if you really are facing those, and many of us are. So we'll just leave the poll open for another moment or two, give everyone an opportunity to weigh in. All right, well, let's go ahead and close the poll and see what y'all said.
So everybody's worried about everything. And to really understand that, I think we would have to delve into the specifics of each of your situations. But I think, one takeaway that I would have from this is it's not just catastrophes. It's not just, war in Ukraine. I mean, there are a lot of risks that ultimately all, manifest in challenges with supplying products to the right customers, at the right time. So that's helpful. Thank you for sharing. So one thing that one question that we've gotten a lot from clients is that, and we've talked about this already, like, is this, now that we're done, quote unquote, done, with COVID, are people going to not focus as much on risk and resilience? And one way to think about that, and not the only way, but is to look at what CEOs talk to their investors about in their earnings calls as a proxy for what's on their minds. And if you look at roughly 5,000 companies' earnings calls each quarter, what we have here is the most frequently discussed topics. And what you can see is that supply chain risk and resilience has consistently been very high in the list. And that, at least as of Q4, would suggest that CEOs, haven't moved on from the topic. It's interesting to see. I mean, no surprise, you see the kind of gradual rise, worries about inflation, obviously a lot around Ukraine. But supply chain risk and resilience, from COVID, if we had this data further back, I suspect it would tell a similar story. But this remains a topic of interest for senior leadership, not just in supply chain, but for companies overall. One thing that is important to think about is, what do we really mean by resilience? And I'm sure there are very different ways of defining it, but from a BCG perspective, very simply, our definition is the ability to absorb a shock to the supply chain when some disruption happens, and the ability to recover quickly when those shocks occur. And what we would say is that those companies that can be impacted less from shocks and bounce back faster are in a place to thrive even after that particular shock has passed. And this is an important point. I think some people will think about, well, resilience means that I can kind of navigate this storm and then get back to normal, which is true. But also, the normal that you get back to, if you look at that green line there, is, has higher performance than the non-resilient companies. And that is an important point to keep in mind when thinking about what is the value of having a resilient operations or having resilient supply chains. It has lasting and long-term business impacts. And that is not just a conceptual point. We can see that in recent years, those companies who have had resilient operations have performed better in terms of gross profit compared to the resilience laggards in their same industries and sectors. And this is a powerful point. The more companies think of ops resilience not as a cost, but as a potential competitive advantage, the more eager they are to understand their current risk profile and improve their resilience. So how do you do it? Based on working with dozens of clients in recent years, we framed a way to think about and to talk about resilience. There's a lot going on here, but let me talk you through it. In our view, core to anything about resilience is visibility to your end-to-end supply chain and an assessment of the risks that you face. Jeremy made the point a little bit earlier about this is really not just about companies' own operations, but about their suppliers' operations or their suppliers, tier 2, tier N supply chains. And that visibility, without that visibility, it's really hard to understand, where are those weak points or risky points within your supply chain. Once you have that visibility and assessment, there are two dimensions to think about. At the top there, recover. So a company's abilities to react faster when a shock or disruption occurs. And there are three major elements to that. The first, monitoring and sensing, how quickly can I see when there is an actual shock or a potential shock or disruption? And can I get that signal more quickly? Two, predictive modeling. Think about this as, scenario assessment. What would happen if X happens? How would my operations be impacted? And, third is crisis response. I don't think that I've at least yet to see a company that is immune to all sorts of shocks or all sorts of disruptions to their supply chain. And so knowing how you will respond when one of those crises occur is quite important. The other dimension we talked about on the bottom here was absorb, structuring your operations and supply chain to be able to either be less vulnerable to shocks or to minimize the impact when they do occur. Inventory is a common lever here, right? Where and how much do we hold in case something goes wrong? But it's not just inventory. The way you structure your network, how you set up and how you manage your supplier base, and even in some industries, how you design your products are all levers that can be pulled and that we've seen companies pulled to enable them to absorb some of these shocks better. The enablers here are critical, and we won't do them justice today, but just to highlight a couple of things. One, digital tools can play a really big role here, both on the top and bottom. And then the second point I'd like to land here is that the people, the skills and processes and culture to operate around understanding resilience and optimizing to increase resilience are an absolute necessity. So we are curious, given this.
Before you go over there, Ben, maybe just a couple of examples to add to this that might be interesting to hear about. So when we talk about the ability to recover and react faster, we know that there's no way you can predict every risk and eventuality. And no matter how good you are, you can never fully insulate yourself or your supply chain and be able to fully absorb. And so if you can know about a risk or you can know about an issue that's coming before other people, then you can get a first mover advantage. You can lock down that extra capacity at your supplier. You can gobble up whatever inventory is at a distributor. You can try to get out in front of this more quickly than other folks. And that's what really the whole top of this wheel is about. It's about getting out in front of things and getting an indication that something's going wrong or will go wrong more quickly than your competitors. And if we look at some of the things around the bottom of the wheel, flexible product and engineering is actually an interesting one. I was working with an electrical manufacturer last year, and this was a big issue for them, is that in a lot of their products, they had these older technology electrical components that were becoming increasingly difficult to source, and where there's maybe only one supplier, two suppliers globally that made these, and they were located in, really far away. This is a US company, and these suppliers are located in China. And so that opens them up to a ton of risk. And by redesigning some of those products and going through a process of redesigning and re-engineering to use newer technology, not only are they able to occasionally find ways to reduce cost, but they increase the optionality that they have in their supply chain in order to be more flexible and address risks. And it's kind of the same thing with sourcing strategy. Sourcing strategy is also about trying to increase your optionality, have dual sourcing, but also where your suppliers are located. Are they located close to the point of manufacture or halfway around the world, as an example?
Yeah. And Jeremy, that's actually also interesting. There's a question in the chat around partnerships and alliances. And I think, no companies really operate in a vacuum, right? They are dependent on suppliers and partners, et cetera. We do see that there is value in less transactional relationships with suppliers. It surprises me every time, like how many, global large companies really interact on a PO basis with suppliers and don't have any sort of visibility into even where their products are made, who their upstream suppliers are. So yes, I think stronger relationships with partners is important. I think that an important corollary to that is that part of, if you're sitting down there at the bottom and thinking about your sourcing strategy, one of the levers within there is thinking about whether it's, dual sourcing or regional sourcing, but not having fewer like single points of failure. And so it doesn't have to be one or the other, but, you have to be thoughtful that you're not, well, I'm going to, lock up with this supplier and we'll have a great relationship. But, that can actually, in some ways, depending on what happens, start to increase your risk. And so you need to do that. You do need to kind of get richer relationships with your suppliers, but not exclusively. You also need to think about other levers to spread out your risk, which may be involve additional partners as well. So good. So here is our poll. I'm curious, using our definitions we just talked through. What are you all thinking about? What are some of the capabilities that you are either focused on building, this year, or would like to build this year? What's most prominent in your organizations?
Yeah, while we're waiting for that to come in too, Ronald, I think that was a really great question that you raised. And just to add on to Ben's response, years ago when I was a steel buyer, and if anybody's bought steel, that there's ups and downs in the supply and demand balance of steel, and sometimes you're just really struggling to get the product you need. And I always wanted to be the customer of choice for my suppliers, so that when there was some kind of crisis or when we were on allocation or we needed something quickly, I would be able to turn to my suppliers and they would want to help me out with that. And that doesn't need to mean that you're the customer of choice because you're paying the most for it, but it can mean that you're the customer of choice because you've built a relationship and you look for opportunities to create shared value with your suppliers and collaborate very closely with them. And so supplier relationship management is a really important part of that pillar. But also, like Ben said, even if you have a very close, tight partnership, you still may not want to put all your eggs in one basket. You may want to have secondary qualified sources, backup suppliers, that kind of thing.
That's right. And yeah, I mean, Jeremy, being, as you were saying, being the customer of choice is, it means one thing when you're, the big kid on the block, right? And kind of throw your weight around. But in a lot of cases, in a lot of companies, you're not. And so being able to be a little more thoughtful and creative, as Jeremy was describing, is important for most people. All right. So this is really interesting, and a little bit later, Jeremy will talk through some of what we're seeing in the survey that we did with APQC in terms of where companies are focusing, and I think it is not dissimilar from this, and not to try and draw too much from this poll, but it looked like that. I mean, if the top three are our react dimensions, there is a sense here on the monitoring and sensing that you're saying, well, I don't want to be surprised next time. Like, let me get a better view, and this wasn't part of the question, but whether that's through a control tower or other sort of digital tool to kind of give me that early warning signal. It sounds like is an area where everyone is prioritizing. And I'm not surprised. The flexible products and engineering, I mean, this is, frankly, this is not applicable to all industries. And so that's a fair point. But as Jeremy was saying, I was his experience, but I was working with a med tech company in a similar situation. They had semiconductors that had been designed in the 80s that were still in products that they were selling today. And there are no companies that make them anymore. So anyway, that's super interesting.
Yeah,
so
it is interesting too. Like network, I would say that the two most expensive things to do on this page are network design and flexible products and engineering. Those require the biggest changes to your company. And those were the two things that were kind of the least popular focus areas for participants.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, why don't we talk about our benchmark a little bit, Jeremy?
Sure. Sounds good. So some of the folks on the call here may have participated in this benchmarking study that we did. Others may have not, but recently, I would say last fall timeframe, kind of going through January with some stragglers in Asia Pacific, we went out with APQC, went out to 185 companies across North America, Europe, and Asia. We focused on some key sectors: automotive, consumer electronics, industrials, pharma and medtech, and retail, with a comprehensive capability survey that hits on all the dimensions of the framework that Ben just went through on the previous page. And we did a whole bunch of analysis on that, and we'll show you some of those results. But in addition to that, we created a scoring algorithm to look at a composite score across all the recover dimensions, so the top of that framework, and all the absorb dimensions, which is the bottom of that framework on the previous page. And we plotted companies on this matrix into one of these four different quadrants. And so folks in the upper right we're calling thriving. And those are folks that both have strong capabilities to absorb any kind of disruption that comes and are able to respond very quickly when something happens. And on the flip side, folks in the reactive quadrant are relatively weak, meaning they're not really well prepared for whatever that next disruption is that might come. And then we have some folks that are insulated, meaning they're actually have a really good absorb capability, but they're not great at responding quickly, and then vice versa in the responsive quadrant. So if we move on here to the next slide, you can see, first, here's an example from the survey of one of the 20 survey questions. And so we have some detailed descriptions around network design, for example, of what really good looks like, what pretty good, fair, poor look like, and companies were asked to self-select based on these descriptions, which one most closely matched their current level of capabilities. In addition to these type of capabilities questions, we also had some quantitative questions about changes in inventory levels and percentages of suppliers in the same country that you manufacture in, things like that, as well as questions about specific capabilities around digital and visibility into your extended supply chain. So all of those kind of came together to form these composite scores. And what you can see, and this was a little bit surprising to us when we actually looked at the results, is that about 80% of companies fell into this reactive quadrant, meaning they kind of self-rate themselves as not great on both of these dimensions. And only about 10% of companies fall into that upper right thriving quadrant. And then you've got 5% in responsive, 5% in insulated. And so what that tells us, if you think back to what Ben was talking about how more resilient companies perform better. They perform much better in the face of a crisis, but they also are able to maintain a sustained advantage coming out of the crisis because they're able to serve customers and they're able to win business that their competitors can't, during those crises. And so what this tells us is that there's actually a lot of room here. If you want to put a concerted effort and you want to invest in this resilience capability, there's a lot of room for you in the upper right in order to turn disruptions, to turn crisis, and even just day-to-day fluctuations in supply and demand into a source of competitive advantage for your company. And then if we dig a little bit deeper into some of the different elements on recover and absorb, and one of the questions that we asked is basically, where are you focusing your attention? Just like the poll question that we had earlier. And if we look at the companies in the upper right versus the companies in the lower left, so the green are the thriving companies, the red are the reactive companies. What we see is that reactive companies are spending a lot more time and effort and focus on recover dimensions, on being able to know when a crisis is happening and to take a proactive response to get out ahead of it. But that's only kind of one piece of the puzzle. And what we saw is that thriving companies were quite a bit more, they still focused on recover, but they were quite a bit more balanced, and they were putting more emphasis on network design, sourcing strategy, and inventory and planning than the reactive companies, showing that they're willing to invest in some of these more difficult, longer-term kind of structural moves. So regardless of whether you're focusing on the top or you're focusing on the bottom, there could be an opportunity to try to focus, to try to be more balanced across the board, to be able to both absorb and to be able to recover from any kind of disruption or crisis.
And Jeremy, an imperfect analogy, but one that some clients have latched onto is, the top half there, recovery. You can almost think of this as firefighting. Like, oh my gosh, there's a fire headed my way. Like, let me mobilize the resources to deal with it. And there's almost a cultural, that gets celebrated and rewarded. And the bottom, if you think about it as fire prevention, it doesn't get the same kind of prioritization. It's not as in your face, like, oh my gosh, something is on fire. And so that may explain, at least for some companies, why there's more reactive companies, more attention on the top. But I think we would, as Jeremy was saying, we would argue that in general, companies should be focusing on both dimensions and not just getting really good at fighting fires.
Yeah, that's a good point, Ben, and it kind of brings up something somewhat related, which is how do you make the business case for an investment in resilience? Because in a lot of ways, it's a bit like an insurance policy. In the best case scenario, you spend money on it and you never end up needing to use that investment. Maybe you invest in localizing your suppliers, but then global shipping stabilizes and it becomes not as big of an issue. And so in some ways, you're sort of taking some, on the bottom half of this, you're taking some bets on what the future is going to look like. And you may be increasing your costs in some of these areas in order to have a shorter supply chain, in order to have multiple sources, et cetera. But if you really think about resilience as a way to gain a competitive advantage, then all of a sudden that kind of business case around making an investment here becomes a little bit easier to swallow, and something that executives, senior executives who are going to approve the budget and the investment in resilience, it's something that can get their attention and that can show an actual return on investment. That it's not just about, hey, we need this to keep up with the Joneses, or hey, we just got out of this crisis and you could see we did terribly, so we need to build something. But it's less about, hey, let's just react to whatever the latest thing was. And it's more about, let's think proactively about where we can create the most value with resilience. And when we help our clients look at a supply chain resilience strategy, we think pretty critically about where do you pull each of these levers and how much do you pull each of these in order to maximize the return that you're going to get from it. Like, you could probably localize 100% of your supply base, but that's likely to just be really expensive and not provide enough return. But maybe there are some suppliers with very critical components that if there's a disruption in global shipping, are going to have disastrous consequences for your company. And in those cases, it may be worthwhile to make some of those strategic investments. But there's also some trade-offs. Is it better to localize, or is it better to get a dual source? Or is it cheaper to just build up a bunch of extra inventory or design in a new type of component that can be substituted? And so when you think about resilience, you can't just say, oh, we're going to do all of this stuff, we're going to do it across the board, but it actually needs to get really specific to components, to materials, to suppliers, and which ones are going to have the greatest impact on your company if something happens, and where do you get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of your resilience investments. So speaking of investments and resilience, actually, another thing that was interesting from these survey results is that thriving companies in general are planning to increase their attention, focus, and investment in both the absorb and recover dimensions over the next year. So we asked them, well, where are you focusing in 2022 and where are you going to focus in 2023? And reactive companies are planning on average to stay about the same. So there's some shifting among the priorities, but in general, they're planning about the same level of focus, attention, and investment. And so this gap between the companies in the upper right that are really good at this and that are able to build a competitive advantage is going to increase from those companies that are in the bottom left. So again, this helps support the idea that an investment here in resilience, in being more proactive and structurally changing your supply chain to be able to really thrive in the face of some kind of disruption, has the potential to create a big source of value for your company. So let's do another poll. So knowing what we just described and some of the attributes here, what's your best guess of where your company sits on this matrix today? Do you feel like, yes, you're great at both things? Are you better at one than the other, or do you feel like you've got a long way to go on both dimensions?
And while they're doing that, Jeremy, I was thinking that on the last slide around, thriving companies like increasing their investment. I mean, in some ways, that's an important call to action. Like, if you believe that having resilient operations, having a resilient supply chain gives a competitive advantage, then for those and obviously the companies that are currently thriving do believe it because they're spending more time and attention and money. It's kind of a call to action for those who are reactive, because if you are being even further behind, for whatever the next shock or disruption that comes, like that can have major and lasting business implications. So I that point always has stuck with me as we've been looking at the results. One question we also get while we're waiting is, well, okay, so if I'm reactive, like what should I do first? Should I go up or should I go right? And it's a very consultancy answer of it depends. But I think in a lot of cases, and maybe I'll keep it at the anecdotal level, that companies tend to kind of, maybe it's an arc, like go up a little bit first because they're like, yeah, that's great. You can talk to me about long-term resilience, but my house is on fire. So I got to deal with that first. And once I've kind of earned the right to talk about structuring my operations better, then I'll focus there. But it does no good to, focus on fire prevention in the midst of an inferno.
A great analogy. All right, everyone, please vote in our poll. Tell us which quadrant you think your organization falls into.
And this is our last poll, so, don't worry.
And don't forget to continue adding your questions into the Q&A and chat tools. We want to answer those at the end of our webinar.
All right, so it looks like we have slightly higher than average percentage of thriving companies here. We've got a good chunk of folks in the reactive, but actually kind of interesting is that we have a much higher percentage in that responsive quadrant than what we saw from the benchmarking report, meaning y'all are good at being able to respond quickly, and you've kind of gotten some visibility and some control over your supply chain, but aren't making all of the longer term investments to prevent the fires, as Ben would say. Interesting. Thanks for responding. All right, so then let's go to the there it goes. Just to wait, did we skip a page? Sorry.
No, we're good.
A little laggy here. Just to recap, if a few of the points that we've made here. So everyone has been affected by this in recent years, especially with COVID and all of the knock-on effects from COVID. And so it's something that continues to be top of mind for CEOs, even though there's other priorities, if you remember back to the earnings call page, that kind of come onto the radar screen, move off of the radar screen. Supply chain risk and resilience has been top of mind and continues to be top of mind. And what we've seen in the data is that companies that are great at this outperform, but most are lacking in capabilities. And that gap between the winners and losers is expected to continue to grow. So there is a big opportunity here for companies that are willing to try to make a step change in capability here and make an investment. An investment doesn't necessarily mean you're just spending a bunch of money on consultants to help you. It could mean that you're building your team in this space. It could mean that you're making investments in your network, in your supply chain, in order to improve your ability to absorb and respond to shocks. And so the question is probably, okay, well, where do we start? So let's say you're in that bottom left corner, and like Ben mentioned, there's kind of no one side that you should purely focus on versus the other. But all journeys need to start at the middle of that circle, which starts with getting visibility to your supply chain and also being able to assess where you're exposed and what your current capability gaps are. So you believe that you're really good at sourcing strategy, but do you know if you're actually good at that? Do you know if you're better at sourcing strategy than your competitors? And same thing with the risk assessment. It gets down to a really detailed per supplier, per component level in looking at what is the potential impact of a disruption? What's the likelihood that something might go wrong? And there's certain indicators that something might go wrong. So for example, a supplier located halfway around the world is more likely to have a transportation disruption than a supplier that's located right next door to the manufacturing facility. A component that is highly engineered, where there's only one source in the world, is more likely to have some kind of a problem that's going to impact you than an off-the-shelf type of commodity item that you can get from a dozen different sources. So figuring out what is the risk profile of every supplier or every component that you're buying or that you're making, and including your own internal manufacturing facilities, both on an impact if something goes wrong, as well as a likelihood or the riskiness that something might go wrong, is where you start to develop a strategy. And then from there, you can prioritize that list of what are those things that are going to cause the biggest disruption or most likely to occur, and you can develop mitigation plans for each of them. And so it might be for some, you just want to monitor and you want to say, look, we want to make sure that we have this supplier, this commodity in our radar screen so that we can respond really quickly. Other things you may say, hey, we want to localize our supply base, or we want to dual source, or we want to build a tighter relationship, or we want to redesign our components. But everything is going to need to have a mitigation plan attached to it. And then you can start to put some of those things into action, as well as building up your capabilities. So for example, you might need better visibility into your supply chain. You may need better access to data, advanced analytics, some kind of system or tool that can help facilitate that. You may need to integrate the ability to consider risk in all of the decisions that you're going to make in your business. So for example, when you're making a sourcing decision, are you just considering cost, or are you also considering what's the risk or what's the impact if something goes wrong with that supplier? So that's a little guidance on kind of what to do to get started. And I mentioned the capability benchmarking. And this was what we did with the 185 companies with APQC. But something that we're offering to everybody who's attending this webinar is, if you would like to participate in that and fill out a survey about your own capabilities, we'll send you back a report for free on kind of where you stack up. And you can look at it not just across the board, but companies in your own region, companies in your own industry, companies of a similar size to you, so that you can try to get an idea of where you are versus your peers along these different dimensions and where you might want to look to improve your capabilities. And so at the end of the webinar here, within the next couple of days, APQC will be sending out this pack along with a link. You can write it down here, you can wait until you get the email, but if you're interested, you can click here and you can go through an online version of that benchmarking survey that we recently did. We'll send you back a customized report. It may take a week or two because we're actually going to put something together for you. It's not just automatically generated out of the system. We also have links that we're going to send out to a number of recent articles and videos and other things that we've published on the topic. And of course, you're always welcome to reach out to me, reach out to Ben if you have any questions, want to discuss where you're at in your resilience journey. We'd be happy to chat with you, and no obligation whatsoever.
And I think that's an important point, Jeremy. It is a journey. This is not, well, let's do, focus on this for 6 weeks and then we'll be fine. Like this is, as your supply chain evolves, over quarters, if not years, like, can we bend the curve, towards more resilient over time?
So with that, we'll move into the Q&A session. I don't see anything quite yet in the comment box, but I don't know, have there been any questions that have come in?
We do have a couple. The first one is a follow on a little bit from the earlier question about collaboration. And the question is now less about buyer-supplier collaboration and more about what we saw during COVID, where there was greater collaboration between or among competitors in various industries, different institutions, academic organizations, and even governments. And so the question is that related to network design or how an enterprise might choose to engage or execute its business going forward? So there's a question about that in terms of resilience.
That's an interesting one. And I certainly know when we're talking about things like the actual COVID crisis and the healthcare response to it, there was an extreme amount of collaboration across various different companies, public and private institutions, in order to try to get a vaccine developed and distributed and all of those kind of things. I don't know about, though, actually in like normal, I do a lot of work in industrial goods, and I haven't seen an increase in collaboration with competitors, at least among my clients. I don't know. I'm curious, Ben, if you've seen anything.
Yeah, I mean, I probably have more exposure to like pharma and med tech, and I think there are some opportunities there. I mean, certainly for public health threats or other pandemic preparedness. I think it's a very valid point. But I was trying to think as you were talking, like, what would if I was, selling widgets? I don't know if I think it's maybe a little bit different situation. So I think there are probably niche areas where that makes sense, and some of the areas that I'm familiar with fall into that. But I suspect that is more, for certain nuanced situations rather than a broad general statement.
Okay, sounds good. So we have another question here. You mentioned a number of resilience initiatives that relate to the procurement and logistics functions, and she's curious to hear, what does resilient look like in the warehousing arena?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's an interesting question. I think it's more about a company's own operations. I take it you're thinking about warehousing, and let's say labor shortages as an example is something that we've all been experiencing. And so if you have a warehouse and you need to get product out the door, but you don't have enough people in order to do it, how do you think about that and how do you manage that? Some of the things that we've seen clients investing in since the labor crisis has materialized over the last couple of years is increased levels of automation and diversification of supply, and thinking strategically about where they locate, for example, their warehouses. That it's not just about what's going to provide the lowest freight costs, but also thinking about things like what's our access to labor pool in this area of the type of labor, skilled or unskilled, that we're going to need in order to manage and run these warehouses.
Okay. And we've received a few more questions, and hopefully we have time to answer them all. If we don't get to your question during today's call, we will follow up via email with you. So Here's a question. In our experience, resiliency and purchasing can sometimes be at odds with their incentives, driving down cost versus investing more in a diverse, local, or resilient supply chain. What methods exist to address this?
Yeah. So this is something that Jeremy and I talk about a lot. Like, is there, well, there may be two ways I would answer that. One is a question around, is there like this trade-off between I can either, optimize for cost or I can optimize for resilience? And I think that is an oversimplification of the problem. I mean, yes, in some situations there is that stark of a comparison, but I think particularly, and Jeremy was talking just as an example about automation or, process redesign. I think it is our firm belief that it is not an either or, that in most cases there are ways to become more resilient while maintaining a competitive cost position. Stepping back a minute around incentives or measurement. So there are enablers on the right hand side of our framework. You're exactly right. Like if in the procurement function, if no one, if your metrics and your boss and whoever are not thinking about this topic, then it's not going to get the attention. And so that's why this is not just a technology solution. It's not just a network solution. Like, it is a culture and governance and metrics and incentive solution. It has to be holistic. Otherwise, you're putting band-aids on a problem that aren't gonna get you where you need to go.
Yep. And I think like what I've seen as best practice is, for example, when you're making a sourcing decision, actually having a balanced scorecard to make that decision, which cost is of course an important factor, but also elements of risk and resilience. And let's say you have a risk monitoring or risk sensing type of capability. What's the risk score for the component that you're buying or for the supplier that you're proposing? And including those kind of considerations into the sourcing decision about whether you want to use that lower cost China source or higher cost source more locally, or whether you want to split your volume across two suppliers at the cost of perhaps a slight increase in price from both of them. And so there's no like one easy answer, but it's something where you actually need to have a considered dialogue about it. And you need to be armed with some of the right facts and information in order to make that informed decision.
Well, Jeremy and Ben, I think we're going to have to let that be the last question we answer live during the webinar. But I do want to let everyone know we've received quite a few more questions. We've captured those and we will follow up with you afterwards. So I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today and sharing the results of the benchmarking that we did with you all. And once again, everyone who registered will receive a copy of the slides and the recording. And we're also going to include those links to the important information that Ben and Jeremy have offered in terms of your ability to take the benchmark and compare your own performance. I do invite you to visit APQC's on-demand webinars page. You can then watch this webinar again if you'd like. There were a lot of really great nuggets shared. And I want to thank everyone for putting their questions in, sharing your thoughts. And I really would like to thank BCG and Jeremy and Ben for the great insights and for really sharing some actionable information with us. Thank you both. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Our pleasure. Thanks very much for having us. Hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, guys.